In the soft haze of distant centuries, where rivers cut through dense jungles of Sumatra, an empire quietly rose like the breath of the ocean. Srivijaya, a name that lingers in the air like a memory, was once the heart of the seas and the ancient trade routes that stitched the world together. The stories of Srivijaya did not begin with towering walls or fearsome armies. They began with the Musi River, its waters flowing ceaselessly, carrying silt and the hopes of fishermen and traders who first settled its banks. These early builders of empire did not shape their kingdom from stone, but from the wood of boats and the endless exchanges of distant lands. It is said that one dawn, as the sun touched the water and turned it to gold, the first leaders of Srivijaya stood on the river's edge. They knew that true power did not lie in the soil alone. It lay in the ocean, in the endless sway of wooden boats that bobbed on the current like fallen leaves, their hulls filled with treasures of the world, spices, silk, gold, and quiet, unspoken secrets. Gradually, Srivijaya transformed into a web of ports, each port a story, each harbor a legend, whispered by the sea's winds. They were not merely merchants. They were the heartbeat of the ocean, weaving east and west together with every perilous voyage. By the 7th century, while mighty empires to the north battled for borders, Srivijaya had become the golden bridge between India and China. Palembang, its capital, was a labyrinth of scents and salt air, a city where Indian, Persian, and Chinese traders came not only to barter, but to find solace in Buddhist temples that rose like lotus blossoms from the river's edge. Yet Srivijaya's true power was not only in its wealth, it lay in its gift for turning rivers and winds into roads of influence. At night, as oil lamps flickered with the tide, one could hear the whisper of thousands of boats, the murmur of the sea, and the quiet prayers of those who sought the favor of the ocean. This was how an empire was born, not by the sword, but by the promise of the sea. And so Srivijaya stepped into history. A kingdom without walls, an empire without borders, yet one that lived on in the rhythm of every wave. As Srivijaya grew, its destiny was shaped by the waters that carried the lifeblood of the world. The spice routes. These winding courses like veins of the earth linked distant lands. India, China, Arabia, and Srivijaya sat at their very heart, a kingdom of sails and silken voices. From the decks of their ships, Srivijayan sailors watched the endless horizon where the line between sky and sea blurred. Their vessels, carved from the dark woods of the jungle, glided across the waves like spirits carrying goods that the world craved. Cinnamon from the forests, cloves that clung to memory with their scent, and nutmeg, a single seed worth the price of blood. The rulers of Srivijaya knew that to command the spice roads was to hold the pulse of empires in their hands. They offered safe passage to merchants who came with full hearts and full holds, while quietly ensuring that every ship's journey was a thread in their vast tapestry of power. The spice-laden winds themselves seemed to whisper Srivijaya's name, but trade was not only a matter of wealth, it was a matter of souls. Srivijaya's ports became places where cultures touched and mingled, where language itself was shaped by the tides. The air in Palembang buzzed with 100 tongues. Sanskrit prayers drifting from monastery courtyards, Chinese poems carried by merchants, the low hum of traders from Arabia, weaving tales of desert sands and distant cities. In these busy harbors, merchants and monks dined together, sharing rice and laughter beneath wooden eaves that smelled of salt and incense. Here, Srivijaya was not just a kingdom, it was a crossroads of faith and learning. Pilgrims from across Asia came seeking knowledge and solace, finding both in the quiet halls of Buddhist monasteries, where the drone of chanting echoed like the hush of waves on stone. At dawn, the sails of Srivijayan ships unfurled like the petals of a lotus, ready to follow the monsoon winds that shifted with the seasons. These winds, powerful and unyielding, were Srivijaya's allies, carrying the promise of new riches and new stories. In the endless rhythm of the tides, the kingdom of Srivijaya found its purpose to be the breath of the sea, the keeper of currents, and the bridge between worlds. And so as the sun rose over the harbor, the sailors of Srivijaya bowed to the horizon, offering a silent prayer to the ocean that had made them more than a kingdom, an empire of the waves, beyond the crowded harbors and the endless exchange of goods. There was another pulse to Srivijaya, one that beat quietly in the shadows of monasteries and the gentle curves of temple spires. While the merchants filled the air with the clang of copper coins, the rulers of Srivijaya turned their eyes to the soul of their empire faith. In the heart of Palembang, monasteries rose like islands of calm in a sea of trade. Their roofs curved skyward, painted with the colors of prayer and dawn. Within their cool stone walls, monks in saffron robes moved in quiet rhythm, their feet whispering across ancient floors, polished by devotion. Their chants drifted like mist through the corridors, weaving a spell of peace that lingered in the mind long after the sound had gone. Srivijaya was a kingdom of the ocean, but it was also a kingdom of the spirit. Its rulers saw no contradiction in holding the treasures of the sea in one hand and the teachings of the Buddha in the other. They understood that faith was not a border to be guarded, but a current to be followed, ever-changing, ever-deepening. Pilgrims came from distant shores, their hearts heavy with questions, and their eyes bright with hope. They found answers not in the clamor of markets, but in the patient silence of these temples, where each flickering lamp was a promise of light in the darkness. Here, beneath carved eaves that told tales of gods and guardians, the stories of the world met the stories of the soul. The scholars of Srivijaya were keepers of ancient wisdom. In palm leaf manuscripts inked in flowing scripts, they preserved not only prayers, but also the maps of stars and the knowledge of tides. These scrolls, fragile as butterfly wings, held the weight of centuries within their folds. In the evenings when the golden sun slipped behind the mangrove forests and the river turned to fire, the chants rose in unison, voices carried on the hush of twilight. In those moments, Srivijaya was more than a crossroads of trade. It was a sanctuary, a quiet testament to the power of faith, to anchor even the most restless waves. For in Srivijaya, faith was not a monument of stone or an empire of conquest. It was a tide moving through every heart, washing over every shore. And in that gentle current, the kingdom found its soul. At the heart of Srivijaya's power lay Palembang, a city where the river's embrace met the endless pulse of the sea. It was more than a port. It was a living tapestry of voices, scents, and dreams that drifted through the humid air like the scent of incense and spices. By dawn, the harbor was already alive. Fishermen with weathered faces guided their small boats through the mists, their nets trailing like silver threads in the early light. Larger ships, sleek vessels of foreign merchants rocked at anchor their hulls, heavy with silk amber and the sweet cargo of distant lands. Palembang was a stage, and every dawn was a new performance. Wooden piers creaked under the weight of goods and footsteps. Traders called out their wares in dozens of languages, each word a promise of possibility. The air smelled of salt of cinnamon and cloves of fish, pulled fresh from the river's mouth. From every corner, the music of commerce rose and fell, clinking coins, laughter, and the low, sonorous notes of temple bells that reminded all who passed that trade was only half of life's journey. Palembang was a city of meeting. Here, Chinese junks with their painted prows met the dark-sailed dhows of Arabia, and Indian merchants in bright silks shared meals of rice and fish with the local traders. Over steaming bowls of broth, alliances were forged, and legends were born. Yet Palembang was more than commerce. Its markets were labyrinths of shade and color, but its spirit was found in the hidden courtyards of monasteries and the cool stone temples that stood sentinel over the river. Pilgrims arrived on creaking boats, their eyes searching for the soft light of a temple's lamp. Here, faith and trade were woven together, as tightly as the mats on which traders knelt to pray. In the evenings, as the sun melted into the river, Palembang took on an almost unreal glow. The waters turned gold, and the city itself seemed to breathe in unison with the tide. Lanterns flickered to life, and in their trembling light, the port became a world apart, a place where the promise of distant lands met the quiet certainty of the river's flow. It was in Palembang that Srivijaya's true magic lived. Not in the grandeur of palaces, but in the humble mingling of faith and commerce, of river and ocean of hearts that beat with the same unending rhythm as the tide. Here the empire found its voice soft as a prayer, deep as the sea. In the quiet dawn of the 7th century, a traveler set sail from China, driven not by trade or conquest, but by a hunger of the spirit. His name was Yi Jing, a Buddhist monk, a scholar, and a seeker of wisdom. His journey would take him across the wide oceans to the heart of Srivijaya, a kingdom he would immortalize in his patient, deliberate words. The sea was a world unto itself, and Yi Jing's voyage was no easy crossing. Monsoon winds rose like spirits, and the crests of the waves seemed to whisper both welcome and warning. But Yi Jing was resolute, his heart steady as the rhythm of the tide. In the dark holds of merchant ships, and in the flickering lamplight of foreign ports, he read his texts and whispered his prayers. When at last he arrived in Srivijaya, he found not a kingdom of warriors, but a kingdom of quiet scholars and humble faith. Palembang greeted him like an old friend, its harbors wide open, its monasteries glowing like beacons in the humid night. Here he discovered a place where learning was as precious as gold, and where the teachings of the Buddha flowed like the river itself. Yi Jing stayed in Srivijaya for years, studying Sanskrit and the ancient scriptures preserved by the monks. The kingdom's monasteries became his refuge, and its people his teachers. In the gentle cadence of prayers chanted at dawn, he heard the true voice of Srivijaya, a voice that echoed across oceans and centuries. He wrote of Srivijaya's generosity, of the way its rulers welcomed foreign scholars with kindness and grace. In his meticulous notes, He preserved not only the rituals of the monks, but the quiet dignity of a kingdom that had made knowledge its crown and faith its foundation. Bumijing's writings would become one of the few surviving windows into Srivijaya's golden age, a testament to a time when the kingdom was a crossroads of devotion and discovery. His journey was a bridge between worlds, a reminder that the sea was not a barrier, but a path. And in his words, the spirit of Srivijaya still drifts like the tide through the quiet places of history. In the soft murmur of the river and the hush of monastery halls, another force moved through Srivijaya, a quiet diplomacy that shaped the fate of empires. For while faith was the kingdom's sole alliances, and rivals were its heartbeat pulsing beneath every tide, Srivijaya was no island. Its harbors lay open to the world, but that openness was also a door to danger. The kingdom's rulers understood that the ocean's promise was matched by its peril. To survive, they wove a web of alliances as intricate as the fishing nets cast each dawn into the river's depths. With Indian princes and Chinese merchants, Srivijaya forged bonds of trade and trust gifts of spices and silks, of rare woods and fragrant oils sealed with whispered oaths. In the cool shade of palace courtyards, envoys in silk robes spoke in many tongues, their words as carefully chosen as any cargo. Yet for every friend made, there was always a rival watching the horizon. The seas were alive with other powers, Javanese kingdoms that dreamed of conquest and distant empires whose fleets tested the limits of Srivijaya's reach. These were not wars of armies, but of merchants and treaties of quiet promises and sudden betrayals. To keep its balance, Srivijaya learned to listen to the sea's restless murmur. The rulers watched the monsoon winds and the currents of trade reading in their patterns the shifting alliances of the world. Like the river, they bent and flowed around obstacles never breaking, always finding another path. In the evenings, the courtyards of Palembang glowed with lantern light, and the air was heavy with the scent of clove and jasmine. Here deals were struck over cups of sweet tea, and friendships were tested in the flicker of a candle's flame. The kingdom's strength was not in the sharpness of its blades, but in the patience of its listening heart. For Srivijaya knew that power was not won by conquest alone. It was held in the hush of diplomacy and the trust of allies, and in the careful dance of rivals kept at bay. In the ebb and flow of alliances, the kingdom found its place in the world's wide sea, a place carved not from conquest, but from the gentle currents of understanding. If Srivijaya's rivers carried the whispers of faith and trade, they also bore the glint of treasures that stirred the imagination of distant lands. The kingdom's wealth was no mere rumor. It shimmered in the golden coins that passed from hand to hand, in Palembang's markets, in the jeweled adornments of its rulers, and in the tales that drifted across oceans. Merchants spoke in hushed voices of the vaults beneath Srivijaya's palaces, where gold was stacked like grains of rice, and precious stones glowed in the flicker of oil lamps. Rubies, the color of blood emeralds, green as the jungles that cloaked Sumatra. These were not only ornaments, but symbols of a kingdom's power and reach. Yet for Srivijaya, wealth was more than a matter of coin and gem. It was woven into the very air of the kingdom, in the heady scent of spices that perfumed the harbor, in the soft luster of silk that draped the courtyards of merchants and monks alike. Here, riches were not confined to the vault. They lived in the hum of trade and the quiet dignity of artisans' hands. Stories spread far beyond the kingdom's shores. Sailors returning from Srivijaya spoke of a city where lanterns burned with the light of 1,000 stars, and the streets shimmered like the river at dawn. These were tales that grew with every retelling, until Srivijaya itself became a legend, a kingdom of gold that lay at the edge of the world. But beneath the weight of jewels and the glow of gold, there was a deeper truth. Srivijaya's true wealth was not in what it could hold, but in what it could share. Its harbors welcomed the world, its temples offered sanctuary to every seeker, and its rivers carried the promise of endless journeys. In the end, it was not the gleam of precious stones that kept Srivijaya alive in memory. It was the quiet knowledge that in the kingdom of Srivijaya, even the humblest of travelers could find a treasure of their own. A moment of peace, a whispered prayer, a glimpse of the horizon where sky and sea meet. The ocean was never still, and neither was the fate of Srivijaya. Beyond the soft chants of temples and the sweet scent of spices in Palembang's markets, the kingdom's story was also a tale of tides of politics played out not in courts, but across the restless waters. Srivijaya was the master of the straits, the keeper of the sea's threshold. But power, like the waves, was always shifting. To the south, the kingdoms of Java watched Srivijaya with wary eyes, their fleets rising like storms on the horizon. In the north, the empires of the mainland grew bold. Their ambitions carried on the monsoon winds. It was a delicate balance, a dance of diplomacy that played out in the flicker of lantern light and the creak of ships at anchor. Srivijaya's envoys traveled far and wide, their words as polished as the silk that draped their shoulders. In distant courts, they offered gifts of gold and rare woods, their voices soft as the tide. Yet even the most carefully chosen words could not calm every sea. Rivalries flared like sudden squalls, alliances frayed under the strain of ambition. Srivijaya's rulers watched the horizon with a patience born of centuries, listening to the rumors that drifted on the wind, weighing each decision as carefully as a captain reading the stars. In the harbors of Palembang, this quiet struggle was felt in every arrival and departure. Merchant ships from Java arrived with smiles and cautious eyes, their cargoes rich, but their intentions hidden. Messengers carried letters sealed with wax and silent promises, each word a ripple in the great ocean of politics. And always the monks of Srivijaya offered their prayers for calm seas and gentle winds, knowing that in a world ruled by currents it was the only anchor. In the end, Srivijaya's strength lay not only in its fleets or its gold, but in its understanding of the sea's true nature. The ocean was both a highway and a battleground, a place of trade and of subtle war. To rule its waters was to read its moods, to respect its depths, and to remember that every alliance, like every wave, must eventually break and reform. The ocean was never still, and neither was the fate of Srivijaya. Beyond the soft chants of temples and the sweet scent of spices in Palembang's markets, the kingdom's story was also a tale of tides of politics played out not in courts, but across the restless waters. Srivijaya was the master of the straits, the keeper of the sea's threshold. But power, like the waves, was always shifting. To the south, the kingdoms of Java watched Srivijaya with wary eyes, their fleets rising like storms on the horizon. In the north, the empires of the mainland grew bold, their ambitions carried on the monsoon winds. It was a delicate balance, a dance of diplomacy that played out in the flicker of lantern light and the creak of ships at anchor. Srivijaya's envoys traveled far and wide, their words as polished as the silk that draped their shoulders. In distant courts, they offered gifts of gold and rare woods, their voices soft as the tide. Yet even the most carefully chosen words could not calm every sea. Rivalries flared like sudden squalls, alliances frayed under the strain of ambition. Srivijaya's rulers watched the horizon with a patience born of centuries, listening to the rumors that drifted on the wind, weighing each decision as carefully as a captain reading the stars. In the harbors of Palembang, this quiet struggle was felt in every arrival and departure. Merchant ships from Java arrived with smiles and cautious eyes, their cargoes rich, but their intentions hidden. Messengers carried letters sealed with wax and silent promises, each word a ripple in the great ocean of politics. And always the monks of Srivijaya offered their prayers for calm seas and gentle winds, knowing that in a world ruled by currents, faith was the only anchor. In the end, Srivijaya's strength lay not only in its fleets or its gold, but in its understanding of the sea's true nature. The ocean was both a highway and a battleground, a place of trade and of subtle war. To rule its waters was to read its moods, to respect its depths, and to remember that every alliance, like every wave, must eventually break and reform. For centuries, Srivijaya thrived in the gentle murmur of the sea and the soft glow of lanterns. But even the mightiest tide must one day recede, and in the quiet corners of the kingdom, the first cracks began to appear. It did not happen all at once. There was no sudden storm to scatter the ships, no single betrayal to shatter the alliances. Instead, it was a slow erosion, as patient and relentless as the river that shaped Palembang's banks. The currents of trade began to shift, carrying the promise of riches to new ports, new kingdoms rising on distant shores. The monks noticed at first the silent thinning of pilgrims who once filled their halls, the fading echo of prayers carried on the river's breeze. The merchants felt it in the weight of their cargo, a little lighter each season, as foreign traders found new routes and new partners. Yet in the great halls of Srivijaya's rulers, the decline was harder to see. The gilded pillars still shone in the light of dawn, and the harbor bustled with the daily commerce of the world. But beneath the surface, a quiet unease spread like a crack in the hull of a ship. The kings of Srivijaya watched the horizon, their eyes tracing the sails of distant ships that no longer paused in Palembang's embrace. They sent envoys to new courts, offered gold and sweet words, but the ocean's favor had begun to turn. And in the deep hours of the night, as the waves lapped softly against the piers, even the bravest sailors wondered if the tide had shifted for good. For Srivijaya had always been a kingdom of the sea, its strength born of the endless dance of wind and water. And now, in the quiet of dusk, it was the sea itself that whispered of change. A new current moved beneath the surface, and the kingdom that had ruled the straits for centuries felt for the first time the pull of forces beyond its reach. In the hush of twilight, Srivijaya remained its lanterns still glowing, its monks still chanting. But in that gentle light, the first cracks had appeared, and with them, the knowledge that no empire can hold the sea forever. As the sea's favor waned, and the currents of trade shifted, darker shadows crept across the waters of Srivijaya. To the south, the island of Java rose a kingdom of fierce warriors and cunning kings, its ambitions as restless as the tide. The Javanese envoys had long watched Palembang's golden harbors, measuring Srivijaya's strength with calculating eyes. They had come first as traders, their ships heavy with rice, and promised their words as sweet as the scent of spices on the wind. But in their hearts, they carried the hunger of conquest, a hunger that would one day turn their sails to war. The first invasions came like the sudden squalls of the monsoon, swift, unexpected, and merciless. Javanese ships, dark against the horizon, descended upon Srivijaya's ports with the quiet menace of gathering storms. Their warriors leapt from their boats like shadows, blades glinting in the flickering light of oil lamps. In the chaos, the quiet order of Srivijaya's harbors cracked. Merchants fled with what goods they could carry, their cries lost beneath the clash of steel and the roar of burning warehouses. Monks gathered in the temple courtyards, their chants rising above the smoke prayers offered to calm seas and safe refuge. The kings of Srivijaya rallied their defenders, but the tides of fortune had begun to turn. For centuries, Srivijaya had ruled the waves with the gentle hand of trade and faith. But now it faced an enemy who came not for the promise of spices or the sanctity of temples, but for the kingdom itself. In the nights that followed, the rivers of Palembang ran dark with the echoes of battle. And in the quiet dawn, when the smoke lifted and the harbors lay silent, the people of Srivijaya felt the weight of a new truth. The ocean that had once been their shield had become a door for invaders. Yet even in the face of conquest, Srivijaya did not fall all at once. Its spirit was as deep as the sea, its faith as patient as the tides. But the Javanese had planted their shadow in the kingdom's heart, and from that day forward, the waters that had carried Srivijaya's wealth now carried whispers of its decline. In the years that followed the Javanese invasions, the kingdom of Srivijaya found itself adrift in a world that was no longer its own. The tides that had once carried riches and pilgrims now carried the ambitions of new empires, their sails bright against the horizon. The merchants of Arabia and India, who had once filled Srivijaya's harbors with the hum of 100 languages, turned their eyes to other shores. The Song dynasty of China, once a steadfast partner in trade and learning, shifted its focus to new ports, rising in the north places, where fresh opportunities blossomed like the monsoon rains. Srivijaya watched as the river of commerce began to flow around it, seeking faster routes and safer harbors. In Palembang, the market still bustled, but there was a hollow note beneath the clink of coins and the murmur of prayer. The old paths of trade, so long, the kingdom's lifeblood, were changing with the winds. For the kings of Srivijaya, this shift was as silent and certain as the turning of the tide. They sent emissaries to far lands offering gold and honeyed words, hoping to steer the currents back to Palembang's embrace. But the world beyond had grown restless, and the kingdom's gentle diplomacy could not hold back the flood of change. In the monasteries, the monks turned their prayers to the sea, seeking calm in a world that seemed to slip through their fingers like water. They understood that empires like the rivers must one day change course, that even the strongest current cannot flow unchanged forever. Yet even as the currents shifted, there remained a quiet dignity in the kingdom's fading light. The scent of spices still clung to the air, and the temples still rose above the river's edge, their carved spires catching the last glow of the setting sun. In the hush of evening, the people of Srivijaya carried on their lives, woven into the slow rhythm of the tides. For in Srivijaya, there was still the memory of the sea's gentle promise, a promise that even in decline, the kingdom's spirit would drift onward, carried by the currents of memory and the hush of whispered prayers. As Srivijaya's ships fell silent and its harbors grew quiet, the kingdom's story began to shift from history to legend. In distant lands, merchants and sailors spoke in hushed voices of a golden island, a place where rivers shimmered with the promise of riches, and where temples rose like dreams from the mist. These were the tales that drifted across the oceans, myths woven from the memory of Srivijaya's golden age. They told of a kingdom where the air was scented with cinnamon and clove, where pearls lay hidden beneath the river's silt, and where the wisdom of the Buddha echoed in every breath of the wind. In these stories, Srivijaya became more than a kingdom. It became a symbol of the sea's endless possibilities, a vision of a place where faith and fortune walked hand in hand. And in the flicker of lanterns on distant shores, the name Srivijaya took on a shimmering quality, like a jewel glimpsed in the shadow of a wave. Yet even as these myths grew, the kingdom itself faded into the hush of memory. The rivers still flowed through Palembang, but their currents carried fewer ships. The chants of monks still rose in the temples, but fewer pilgrims knelt in the cool stone halls. Srivijaya's wealth and power had ebbed away, leaving only the whisper of its name on the lips of those who still remembered. But in the hearts of sailors and storytellers, the legend lived on. They spoke of hidden vaults filled with gold, of secret harbors, where the tide still sang Srivijaya's name. And in the hush of the night, when the sea was calm and the stars bright, it was said that the ghosts of Srivijaya's ships still drifted on the horizon, silent, patient, and eternal. For in every myth, there is a seed of truth, and in every whispered legend of Srivijaya, there is the memory of a kingdom that once ruled the waves, not with the sharp edge of a blade, but with the gentle power of faith and the soft murmur of the tide. Centuries passed, and the name Srivijaya drifted further into legend, a whisper carried on the monsoon winds. Yet the sea never forgets. In the soft murmur of waves against the shore and the glimmer of sunken stones in the riverbed, the memory of Srivijaya still waited to be found. In the modern age, scholars and explorers turned their eyes to Sumatra's rivers and the quiet depths beyond Palembang. They came not with the sails of merchants, but with the curiosity of those who seek the past in the hush of ancient waters. Beneath the shifting sands and silt of centuries, they found the broken bones of a kingdom, fragments of pottery, the worn edges of bronze, the soft glow of gold hidden in the river's embrace. In the shadowed riverbanks, the foundations of temples long thought lost emerged, stones smoothed by time, their carvings faint but persistent. In the muddy shallows, divers uncovered the relics of a vanished empire, anchors from forgotten ships' hoins that still bore the delicate script of Srivijaya's prayers. Each discovery was like a breath drawn from the deep, a moment when the past rose to the surface, shimmering in the river's light. In these small, patient findings, Srivijaya lived again. The river that had once carried its ships to distant shores now cradled its memories, each stone a testament to a kingdom that had ruled not only the waves, but the quiet spaces of the heart. For the people of Palembang, these discoveries were more than relics. They were echoes, reminders that the story of Srivijaya was not gone, only sleeping. In the quiet halls of museums and the careful notes of archaeologists, the kingdom's spirit stirred as restless and enduring as the tide. And so beneath the waters that had once been its kingdom, Srivijaya waited silent and eternal. Its ruins a promise that even the deepest currents cannot erase the memory of an empire born of rivers' faith and the boundless sea. Even as the river's course changed and the trade winds carried new ships to distant shores, the story of Srivijaya was never truly lost. In the quiet corners of Sumatra, in the chants of monks and the patient work of archaeologists, the kingdom's memory lived on. Echoes that drifted like the tide, soft and insistent. For those who listened, Srivijaya spoke not only of gold and spices, but of a kingdom that understood the sea's gentle power. Its rulers had known that faith was as important as trade, that wisdom was as precious as jewels. In the hush of temple courtyards and the steady beat of oars on the river, they had found a balance that many had forgotten. Today, the name Srivijaya is a murmur in the history books, a faint line in the chronicles of empires. Yet for the people of Palembang and the scholars who trace the kingdom's vanished roots, Srivijaya is more than a footnote. It is a testament to what can endure. In the city's narrow lanes, where the scent of clove and river water still hangs in the air, there are quiet reminders of the past. A carving half buried in the roots of a tree, a fragment of pottery turned up by a farmer's plow, a story passed from grandmother to child in the glow of an oil lamp. These are the echoes of Srivijaya, whispers of a kingdom that once held the world in its open, patient hands. And in those whispers, there is a lesson that the sea gives and takes in equal measure, but the stories it carries are never truly lost. They live in the memory of waves and the soft hush of rivers waiting to be heard by those who pause to listen. For Srivijaya's legacy is not written in the ruins of palaces or the weight of gold, but in the quiet endurance of a kingdom that understood the tide, its gifts, its dangers, and the promise of its endless eternal song. In the hush of evening, as the river glows with the last light of the sun, the spirit of Srivijaya still drifts through the waters. Though the kingdom has long vanished into the folds of history, its gentle lessons remain whispers carried by the tide to those who listen. Srivijaya's story is a reminder that the greatest empires are not always the ones built with walls and swords. Sometimes they are the ones built on rivers and prayers, where faith and trade flow together like the currents of the sea. In its quiet harbors and chanting temples, Srivijaya showed that true power lies not in conquest, but in balance, the art of listening, as into speaking, of welcoming, as much as ruling. The kingdom's sailors and merchants understood that the ocean was both a gift and a challenge. They read the monsoon winds like a prayer, trusting in the rhythms of the world rather than trying to force them. And in this trust, they found a strength deeper than any fortress, a strength that still echoes in the rivers of Palembang and the stories told at dusk. Today, Srivijaya's name is a soft echo, a shimmer on the water. But its wisdom endures in the patient hands of those who fish the river's depths, in the quiet faith of monks who light their lamps against the coming night. It lives in the understanding that every tide carries both promise and loss, and that in every journey there is a moment of return. For Srivijaya's greatest legacy was not its gold or its ships, but its understanding of the sea's eternal song. In its rise and fall, the kingdom left behind a lesson as old as the river, that what is shared with an open heart will endure long after the last sail has vanished on the horizon. And so as the river winds on, and the night falls soft and quiet, the memory of Srivijaya drifts on a kingdom of the sea, a kingdom of faith, and a gentle promise that even the faintest whisper can carry the weight of an empire.